Hello and welcome to Eastside Stories. My name is Michael Lewis. I'm a board member at the Eastside Heritage Center. This is the second in a series of videos the Eastside Heritage Center is providing to give you an overview of the history of the East Side. Now, if you're not entirely familiar with the geography, we're talking about the communities to the east of Seattle on the other side of Lake Washington. Lake Washington is about 2 miles wide and provides a pretty significant barrier that makes these communities very unique. This includes cities like Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, Issaquah, Sammamish, and a lot of other smaller communities around the edges that make this a very unique place. In this presentation, we're going to talk about the resource industries that grew up in the later part of the 19th century that really allowed the East Side to start to grow and to flourish. Where we left off in the last presentation in the 1860s, a lot of vacant land. The Indian tribes had been moved off of the land into reservations in the 1850s, and you had a large and growing population in Seattle for a frontier city. And the important thing to remember about Seattle at this time was it was developing as a commercial center. The founders of Seattle didn't want it to be just another mill town, built around a sawmill. And they also didn't want it to be like San Francisco, which was a pretty wild place. And they wanted Seattle to be a little more sedate. Remember, this is the Victorian period, late 19th century, where the middle class and the professional classes and the business owners were really starting to exert a lot of influence. And they wanted Seattle to be a good family city. Not that Seattle didn't have its share of vice, but that was all kept south of Yesler Street, north of Yesler Street, were the respectable communities where families would live. This is also the time, for instance, that the University of Washington was formed. If you want to be a commercial center, the place where people would find their doctor or their lawyer or buy equipment or do other transactions, a university is a great way to get that going. So Seattle was really becoming more than just another city with a sawmill, which there were a lot of around the region, and becoming more of a commercial center. The other thing that we pointed out in the last video was the relationship of Seattle to California and the commercial relationships that had grown up around the need of the Northern California areas for raw materials. With the gold rush in 1849 and rapid growth in California, they needed just about everything, and Seattle and the Puget Sound area could provide that. Steamship service had started on the Pacific Ocean in the 1850s. People could travel from the east coast of the United States down to the Gulf Coast, get to Panama, go across the Panama Isthmus, and onto a steamship on the Pacific side and up to San Francisco. So it was relatively easy to get there now. Not the arduous overland trip or the trip around the Horn. And so people were really flooding in, and they needed a lot of resources and a lot of materials from this area. So the first big event on the East Side from an economic perspective was the discovery of coal. And it's really hard to overstate the importance of this. Coal was the energy of the 19th century. This was the Industrial Revolution. And steam engines were everywhere. They were in locomotives, they were in ships, they were in factories. And coal was used to heat people's homes and to heat buildings. And it was really the energy that was making everything work. Petroleum hadn't been exploited yet. And wood, there's plenty of wood around, but wood has a relatively low energy density, and coal has a lot more. So it was really a prized material and fuel. And there was some coal mining in Northern California, but fairly limited. So the discovery of coal in the Seattle area was a really big deal. The first coal was discovered near Issaquah in 1859, and then subsequently discovered a little later in the area that became known as Coal Creek and the area of Newcastle, south part of Bellevue, and that was discovered in the 1860s and started to be mined. Now the challenge there was getting the coal from those mines to someone in Seattle who could use it. It doesn't seem like a very long distance today, but at that time there were no roads to speak of. So coal was loaded onto mules and wagons and taken down these tracks down to Lake Washington, put on a barge, taken on the barge across Lake Washington to Seattle, and dragged overland in Seattle to someone who might use it. This was pretty inefficient. And around this time, folks, of course, down in Northern California discovered that there was coal up in Seattle, and they wanted to get their hands on it. But they were very frustrated with the slow pace of mining that was taking place in the Bellevue area, so they simply came up and purchased the mines used investment capital from California to expand the mines, buy machinery to make them more productive, and most importantly, to build a railroad that would go from the mines in South Bellevue and Newcastle around the south end of Lake Washington and up into Seattle. And once that railroad was in place, then the mines could become much more productive. And they got quite large, and really large communities built around them. This photo shows one of the coal mines at Newcastle. As you can see, it's a fairly big operation with the railroad tracks coming into it. The mining towns of the east side got to be quite big, with hundreds of people living in them, and a very diverse population. People came from all over the world working in these mines. And they had their families with them, and the mine towns became quite large, but are now almost completely gone. There's a little bit of archaeological evidence left of them, but there's not much left of what were once very flourishing towns. The other important thing is these mine towns provided a market for food that was grown on the east side. So farmers who were growing crops could sell them directly to the mines and have a market for their produce. The next major industry to consider on the east side was logging. As we mentioned in the first program, early homesteaders had to cut down trees in order to farm their land. And in many cases, they simply burned the logs or left them to rot because they couldn't get them to a mill because there was very little in the way of transportation. Well, once transportation improved, railroads arrived, logging became a much bigger thing on the east side, and particularly as it moved somewhat to the east. This photo shows a crew from the Seiler Logging Company. They're cutting down a fairly large western red cedar tree. Now you'll note the guys standing on those boards sticking out of the trees. Those are called springboards, and keep that in mind. We'll get back to that in a little bit. The railroads really made logging feasible on the east side. Logs could be cut down and transported, and mills were started to spring up all across the east side. A big mill in what's now near downtown Bellevue, and quite a number of mills to the east around Lake Sammamish. Logs could be floated down the lake to the mills. Then when the lumber was cut or shingles were made, those products could be loaded on the trains and taken to Seattle to sell elsewhere. The other area of activity on the east side was farming. Homesteaders had spread throughout the east side, and families came along subsequently and purchased land that had been originally homesteaded and set up farms. Some of the farming family names you may recognize: Northup and Sturtevant in Bellevue, Pickering in Issaquah, and Perigo in Redmond. Now, when a lot of the homesteading happened in different parts of the country, where people were far from major population centers, they became essentially subsistence farmers at first. But when you were as close as you were to Seattle on the east side, they could specialize in crops like berries and peas and beans and lettuce, and crops that could be sold immediately in the Seattle market. This was much more efficient farming than growing a little bit of everything just for your family. Later, when the railroads arrived, that allowed these farmers to develop packing operations and sell their produce even beyond the Seattle area. Now you can experience some of these resource activities today. You might go to the Redtown Trailhead, which is just north of the Newcastle Golf Club along Lakemont Boulevard. And that's where there's interpretive signage and trails that you can see the remnants of the mining community that was there. There was once a very large community, almost entirely gone, but you'll see little bits of it there. And what you can imagine is that underneath you is a whole network of abandoned mine shafts all through those hills. They're basically full of water today, but the land looks very serene, but it was once a really bustling industrial operation. Another thing you might do is go out hiking in the Cascades. When you're hiking in the foothills, look around you and you'll see old cedar stumps like this one. Cedar rots very slowly. It's why we build decks and fences out of it. And some of these stumps might be 150 years old. And what you'll see on the side, like in this one, are the springboard notches. Remember those guys standing on the springboards because you wanted to get up higher to cut the tree where it was a little bit narrower. You didn't want to try to cut that really fat base. You wanted to get up a little higher, and the springboard allowed you to do that. And those notches can still be found quite frequently across different parts of the Cascade Mountains. So by the end of the 19th century on the east side, you've got people have filled in really most of the area with homesteads. Farms are starting to flourish. The mining industry is quite robust, sending coal continually to California, first in sailing ships and then in steamships. And logging operations are very active. As they move east, as the trees get cut further, they move further out, but they're still quite active. Now we'll wind up with what was a popular publication in the 19th century, Bird's Eye Views. Illustrators would pretend they were up in the air looking down on communities, and we have a couple of those here. This bird's eye view is from 1878. So Seattle had really only been around only for about 30 years at this point, a little less than 30 years. But you can see it's already starting to spread out. And remember, there were no railroads to Seattle yet. It was still kind of hard to get there, but the city is growing. You'll see the east side way in the distance, Lake Washington near the middle of the illustration. And if you look very closely in that, it does show steamboats on Lake Washington, but not much beyond that. But do notice all the steamboats in the harbor. So again, that's a market for coal. And coal was needed for those steamships. There's also some smokestacks in here that would show mills and other things using the coal that was mined on the east side. This illustration is from a few years later, in 1884. The city is fanning out a little bit, and you again see Lake Washington in the distance and even more steamships in the foreground. So the city is starting to grow, but you also notice there's still a lot of vacant land that the illustrator puts in there, so the pressures to develop and move to the east side were really not that extensive yet. Here's a map from 1890. And what you see here is the areas where developers had platted out areas for homes. The colored areas are subdivisions. And so you see from downtown Seattle, mostly going north, quite a lot of activity in subdividing land and creating neighborhoods. You go to the right side there on the east side, and you see a little bit, but not much. Some on Mercer Island, a little down in Kennydale, around Maidenbower, Hunts Point, and up in Kirkland, which it was developing quite rapidly at that point for other reasons we'll go into in another program. But the development pressures just hadn't quite gotten to the east side yet. In our next presentation, we'll talk about the infrastructure and services and institutions that began to spring up around the east side as communities began to grow. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these presentations, please visit our website and consider making a donation to support our work.